The experiment of the emancipation, of the freeing of the Jews, and of their assimilating into European society went full speed ahead for the first half and into the middle of the 1800s. But by the end of the century, things started to sour. And one of the explanations of what happened was that German bourgeois society, middle-class society, saw Jews leapfrogging over them. As Jews were assimilated into general society, started to advance into education, and then into the professions, and to have more business opportunities, Jews started to be very successful as doctors and lawyers and professors, and also as businessmen. And there was a resentment from the middle class over Jews taking their places and taking their jobs. And so by the end of the century, you started to have a wave of anti-Semitism returning. And that was encapsulated, or perhaps demonstrated, in the Dreyfus affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a French army officer who was accused of treason against France, giving the Prussian enemy in the Franco-Prussian War military secrets. And in 1894, he was brought to court. He was convicted and sent to a prison island. And in 4 years, he aged 40 years. After he was sent away, more of the secret messages which were used as evidence of his treason turned up. And it was clear that it was not, in fact, Dreyfus, but another officer, Esterhazy, who was a womanizer and a gambler, and had been acquitted at the retrial. Nevertheless, there was so much pressure put on the French. There was a great uproar, most notably by the great French writer Émile Zola, who wrote a tractate called J'accuse, accusing the French of courts of anti-Semitism. Eventually, Dreyfus was brought back, a broken man, and lived out his years. And I saw just last week that they finally not only exonerated him, which had been done, but gave him, reinstated his status, his military position in a symbolic gesture. Now, with the rise of the Romantic movement, there was also a movement towards Europe reseeking its roots, a rise of conservatism and of racial theories. And one of the champions of that was Richard Wagner, a great composer, but also terrible anti-Semite. And it says one is not supposed to look at the pictures of evil people, but I put a picture which was appropriate for him here. And there were big debates after the establishment of the State of Israel whether his music should be played by the Israel Symphony, and with arguments going both ways. And he spread the ill will, and people think that the Holocaust, in a sense, came out of a vacuum in the late 20s and 1930s in Germany, but it did not. The anti-Semitic waves had started in Western Europe well before that, as we see. And so these feelings were exacerbated by figures such as Richard Wagner. Here you see some of the characterizations of Jews in the anti-Semitic cartoons. On the left, Jewish socialites who are, as we see, dressing like Europeans and acting like Europeans, but with the hooked noses and the caricatured faces. Another factor which contributed to the anti-Semitism is if Jews in the West were starting to acculturate and look like Europeans, Jews from the East were arriving, and we'll talk about the pogroms and the anti-Semitism, which drove them west. And they didn't look like Europeans. They looked like the Jews from 50, 70 years before in Western Europe. And that exacerbated these sentiments. With the turn against Jews, there was the rise of figures who came to the defense of the Jewish people, particularly Sir Moses Montefiore, an English businessman who had a seat on the Exchequer and a very respected figure. And in the 1840s, there was a blood libel accusation against Jews in Damascus in the Ottoman Empire. They were thrown in prison, ready to be executed. And Sir Moses Montefiore mobilized the international Jewish community to raise funds, to put political pressure, and indeed the Jews were freed. But it was a demonstration of a more political awareness of Jews flexing their political muscle, but also as an international body that would function together as a people on the public political scene. And Moses Montefiore also was known for his support of projects in Israel, even before the beginning of political Zionism. He was also a traditional Jew who kept to his beliefs and promoted Judaism. So with the onslaught of anti-Semitism, you had a phenomenon which had already begun of Jewish conversion. Some Jews feeling like their assimilation was not, they weren't completely accepted in European society, took the final step. And with the onslaught of the anti-Semitic wave, more and more Jews started converting, the numbers increased. Some of the very public notable figures were Rahel Levin Varnhagen, who led one of the big salons of Europe where intellectuals and artists gathered. And she said that even though I have become part of society, there's one stain which still remains holding me back, and that is my Judaism. She married someone who was not Jewish, converted, and yet still felt this way. Although it's reported that on her deathbed at the end of her life, she left some of her wealth to support the poor Jews of Berlin. Another figure, Heinrich Heine, celebrated author, converted in order to be able to go to law school, and then dropped out of law school to become a writer. And he said, paradoxically, now I'm truly Christian. I'm being supported by Jewish patrons. And it is reportedly said that he actually regretted his conversion. And nevertheless, it was too far along to go back. Another celebrated Jewish figure who converted, or whose family converted, was Disraeli, who became the Prime Minister of England. His father had converted when he was a child, and he was a friend of Queen Victoria, a very prominent figure. And he, in a sense, beat aristocracy at its own game. In the House of Lords, when he was speaking, one of the lords mocked him and said, "Oh, he's a Jew, even if he tries to think he's not." And he said, "My dear Lord, when your ancestors, the Druids, were climbing trees and picking leaves, my ancestor, King Solomon, was writing great books of wisdom and building the temple in Jerusalem." So this movement was a noticeable one and increased after the wave of anti-Semitism. Another Jewish reaction to the anti-Semitism was socialism and communism. The ideology launched by Karl Marx and in the Communist Manifesto envisioned a world where everyone would be equal, where social boundaries were torn down between the rich and poor, between different ethnic groups, and everyone would become equal. And we can see the appeal of this. And in Eastern Europe, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, began well after it did in Western Europe, and many young Jews were very drawn to the socialist movements, and that, of course, entailed leaving behind their religion. Karl Marx calling religion the opiate of the masses, and was part of the movement away from Judaism in Eastern Europe. Another reaction is if the Europeans won't accept us, not to change European society as Karl Marx envisioned, but to leave Europe. And in our next installment of the crash course, we'll be focusing upon the birth of political Zionism and the state of Israel. The young men, Theodor Herzl, was a young journalist assigned by his newspaper in Vienna to cover the Dreyfus trial in France. And when he went and saw the hatred and the bias and the crowds chanting death to Dreyfus, he had an awakening and he realized that nothing will change in Europe, and the only solution is to get the Jews out of Europe. And so he started a campaign and the first Zionist Congress was convened in 1897. Of course, we'll go into this in much greater detail. The situation of Jews in Eastern Europe was very dire. The Jews were not allowed to live in Russia. They were relegated to the Pale of Settlement, which is, as we can see from the map, part of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. And in some ways, there is a nostalgia for this Jewish life celebrated in Fiddler on the Roof, based on a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer called Tevye the Milkman. But even in Fiddler on the Roof, we start to see the expulsions, the pogroms, and things turning sour, even as you had the closeness, the Hamishness, the warmth of Jewish society and Jewish traditions as they were lived. And in the movie, it's in a sense a microcosm of the changes going on. They show one of his daughters marries a communist, one of his daughters marries a young man who she falls in love with, and one of them intermarries and marries a non-Jew. The pogroms in Russia were very dire. It began with Catherine the Great in the 1881-1882. Here we see the drinking after non-Jews getting drunk, beating up Jews, killing Jews, and the terrible massacres that went on. And particularly the entire Jewish world was shocked by the Kishinev massacres in 1903. Kishinev was near Odessa, and Kishinev and Odessa were modern towns. They had been created relatively recently. They were multicultural, they were modern and progressive, and yet even there they saw the terrible slaughter of Jews. In Kishinev, 500, in Odessa, 1905, 500 Jews were massacred and 2,000 injured. And it got a lot of international publicity. Here we see a poster for an event commemorating the Kishinev massacre and the depiction of it. And so another solution to the waves of anti-Semitism was the Great Migration. Because between 1880 and 1920, there will be, according to some estimates, up to 1.5 million Jews who will go to the United States, perhaps 2.5 million in all over the next century who will leave Eastern Europe. And here we see the immigrants arriving at the Statue of Liberty. We see the gift which was a gift of France in 1886, and on its base was inscribed, Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. From The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, a Jewish poetess who wrote that in 1883. And of the thousands of immigrants who fled Eastern Europe, they would arrive on the Lower East Side, and as did my grandfather at the young age of 3. And here you have the written manifesto from the boat which crossed the Atlantic. My middle name was Joseph, and I knew he came at the turn of the century. I also knew that my great-grandfather had remarried and that they were from Odessa. So when I found this log of a young Joseph Feldman at 3 years old who came over, his mother was a tailoress, as was Joseph. It says they were from Turkey, but undoubtedly they would have moved from the Odessa across the Black Sea to Turkey, probably to Istanbul. From the crossed out column of J, Jewish, crossed out, it's because she died on the boat, which also corresponded to what I knew that my grandfather was, in fact, a widow and had remarried. And here we see a picture of Jews arriving on Ellis Island. And they actually came, my grandfather came before even the pogroms in Odessa itself, but people were fleeing. My grandmother was from outside of Krakow, and my father never talked about his childhood. And because his mother never talked about her childhood, and all my father knew is that she'd gone through the pogroms and didn't talk about it. My mother's family represented the other side of Europe, Western Europe. They were from Salzburg, Austria, where my great-great-grandfather had resettled in the 1860s. He was in the army, and he was requisitioned by Kaiser Joseph to find antiques for the royal court. He arrived in Salzburg, found it very beautiful, and asked for special permission as a Jew to settle there because Jews had been kicked out in the 1490s. And reminiscent of the court Jews, who were the exception, he was granted that permission. He brought his 2 siblings and their families, and the community grew. Here we see them skiing in 1935, assimilated into Austrian culture and Austrian society. My grandfather loved listening to Mozart. My grandmother was born in the same building where Mozart lived, and not at the same time, of course. And here we see children in the community dressed up for Purim. My mother being on the lower left with the polka-dotted dress. So life was good for Jews in Western Europe until it wasn't. They had a big department store. And then we see in 1938, the boycott, it says Judenschaft, and this is my great-grandfather's store, which my grandfather ran as well after my great-grandfather passed away. And here we have the boycott of Jewish stores with Nazi officers standing in front of it, and the Nazi propaganda of Jews being warmongers, of course, accusing us exactly of what they do. And so the shadows of the Holocaust began, as we said before, half a decade before with the rise of anti-Semitism. And we don't have, tackling the Holocaust is for a whole other discussion. But by the 1930s, you see Poland alone had 3 million Jews. Germany, over 500,000. You have a population of millions of Jews in Europe. The Soviet Union, 2.5 million. And this is after the 2.5 million who left Europe. And of course, the terrible destruction after that. And the Sephardic Jewry, by the mid-1900s, would reach about 1 million, smaller than the Ashkenazi population, but much more stable, to have lived in those areas for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And the Sephardic story in the 18th and 19th century was the same as that had been the decades before that. And it wasn't until really the late 18th, early 1900s that modernity started to arrive as the Arab countries were colonized and as the Ottoman Empire fell apart. And you'll have the beginning of the Jewish assimilation of changing mores in those countries as well, but much more gradual than they occurred in the Ashkenazic countries. And modernity did not advance at the same pace for them. So here we have the story of the transformation of the Jewish populations, a mass exodus from Europe towards the United States, the beginnings of an exodus towards Israel, the transformation of Jewish society and Jewish life, the assimilation, which lost many Jews to conversion and to simply disappearing into the non-Jewish world, and of course, culminating in the disaster of the Holocaust.